Hello and welcome back to Cinebench PC Builds. Today I'm going to add another cooler to the Cooler League. But today is going to be a bit different. I'm going to be adding the first AIO or all-in-one cooler to the Cooler League. All of the coolers that I have included in the league so far have been air coolers. So an AIO includes liquids, so it's got a radiator, fans and a block with pipes going from the radiator to the block, which also normally includes a pump which pushes the fluid around the cooler structure. So it's a very different mechanism, it's a very different installation, it's a very different cooler than your standard air coolers I've looked at so far. And to be fair, a lot of the air coolers I've looked at so far are very reasonably priced compared to, say, an all-in-one cooler, which tends to be a bit more expensive. But with that introduction in mind, let's have a look at the all-in-one cooler that I'm going to add. So the all-in-one cooler I'm going to add is a 360 one, which means it's got three 120 fans and it's also got a 360 radiator. It's from a company which, to be fair, I hadn't heard much about until and heads up, they actually sent this over for me to check out. So this is what are called AMChoice. It's available on Amazon, and there'll be a link in the video description below. I may possibly have a discount code. I've not fully arranged that yet, but if I do get a discount code, I'll also include that in the description down below as well. But this is a standard 360. It's got the radiator, and as I said, it's got the block and combo. So without further ado, let's get the cooler on the test bed and go through the installation, and I'll give you my thoughts on the installation once I've done it. Oh, little jump in there. Before I forget, because this is a liquid cooler and you can actually see it on the test bed behind me, the installation is different than the air cooler, and you can see I've mounted the radiator and fans above the actual board. They've done it this way so the noise travels in the same way, which means I can do valid noise testing and keeping it in line with all the air coolers. To do so, I had to put a bracket on the back for it to mount on, and I'll put a picture up now which has what I put up there, which is effectively a drywall corner bracket. It's basically a corner piece of metal with lots of holes in, so I was able to attach it to the top of the test bed, and I was able to then screw the radiator into the back of it. So that's what I ended up using. I used the Dremel to cut it down, but I also used the Dremel to then file the edges to make sure it's not going to cut any cables, etc, etc. Alright, but that's that covered. Now let's get back to the installation. So the first step for the install is you've got to put these like long screws through what will be the black plate. There you've got to like the rectangles, which you've got to line up with like a little trough on the back. They move around, there's nothing to stop them moving. So it's going to be interesting when putting them through, trying to hold them and put them through. Because if you put them on the box, you'll be okay, because as you put this down you can then line up the motherboard and drop it on. But for me on the test bench, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. I'd recommend after putting the thing through that you have the little rubber washers that you've got to put on next, which hold the screws in place. I'd recommend you keep those really handy. So then when you can push from behind to hold the bolts through, you can just simply slide them into place. So now that they're through, I shouldn't have any particular problems installing the rest, because they're pretty set now and they're not going to go anywhere. So you've got to install brackets on the block as you normally would do on a normal air cooler. You've got to line them up and then it should just slide into place on that side, and then you do this side as well. So now it's ready for installation. Now normally with a air cooler at this point I would now install it on and would be done. One of the key differences between doing an AIO and a normal air cooler installation is you've got to worry about the fans, because obviously you've got to put them on. Now, one of the things I'd mentioned about installing the fans on an AIO, you're going to have a cables coming in a certain direction. Now, if you're going to install it in the front of the case, you've got to make sure that the cables come out where you've got a hole to pass them through, so they can go around the back of the motherboard and to the relevant point on the actual motherboard itself. So if on the front, you'll probably find there's holes by the front so you can pass them through. If you're mounting it at the top, then you've got to be careful, because when you turn it over, it's going to flip like that. So what you want to do is you want to put your cables facing you like this, because then when you spin it round, they'll be at the back, so you can pass them through behind the motherboard, so it keeps the build nice and clean and you don't have the cables knocking around. So the next thing I'm going to do now, with this being an AIO, is I'm going to install the fans. Now the big difference is between say this and say an air cooler is what you've got multiple fans for a starter, and also because when you say attach say case fans to this outside of your case, you'll get these really thick short screws that you use to attach to a case. Now from an AIO, you're obviously going a further distance, and also you're going into a thinner hole on a radiator which you don't want to damage. So they supply you normally two sets of screws. One is a long screw like this, which is for going through the fan like so and go straight into the radiator. The second smaller set of screws are attaching the back of the radiator to the case, because obviously you need a smaller screw to go through. So if you put it on the top, you would line up the radiator, then you would screw in from the top. From the front, you would line it in and then screw in from the other side. The other side from the fans. So in this particular case, you would go in, it'd be like the back of it. So that's why you've got two sets of screws. So now I'm going to install the 12 long screws for all of the fans. Make sure on the radiator that you line up your first screw with the hole. If you put the screw through and then just do a couple of screws, it should hold. And then you can make sure that with the next screw you line it up to the hole. Again, don't tie it all the way, and it should be nice and loose. Do the same again for the ones on the far side. These should be easier to find in terms of putting it in the hole, because it should be nice and lined up. If not, then again, literally wait until it drops the screw, a couple of turns, and it should be in. This one's playing hard to get. There we go. And there's a good reason I'm not screwing them in all the way, is because you do get movement of fans, and you can have problems installing the fans, because if the holes aren't exactly where you think you are and you tighten it up and the fan's too far that way, you'll have problems getting them in. So if you keep them loose, then you can just get the next screw, put it in, find the hole, couple of screw turns, it's nicely in, and then repeat until you've done all 3 fans. Now I've got all 12 screws in, I'm going to go around and tighten them all until they're nicely tight. The fans that come with the cooler are actually pretty decent. Well, they look decent anyway. I don't know what the performance is like going to be out of them, but the one thing I do like about them is you're able to daisy chain the RGB, and also they've got rubber pads where you tighten up the screws to reduce on vibration, which is a nice feature on any fan. And always when you're installing fans, the logo is normally what you would call the front of the fan, so that's like the intake of the fan, and where it's got the no logo is the back of the fan, so where the air comes out. So in this particular case, well, no case intended, but no pun intended even, you can see that these will spin and push air now through the radiator. Okay, so now that the fans are on, we'll get to the next step. As always, when I'm doing this testing, I'm going to be using the same Noctua thermal paste that I use in all of my tests. Now that's on. I noticed there's a film on the bottom of the cooler, so make sure you peel that off, because otherwise you're really not going to get a great result. And then because these are connected and they wobble around, I would hold the radiator until you get the block in the right position. I'm trying not to tighten too tight to keep a little bit of uniformity, because the last thing I need is uneven pressure. So I'm putting a good bit on, but not too much, and then we will try and tighten. Now the problem I've got with this kind of installation method is it's very, very easy to put too much pressure on. So as it is now, I'm now feeling a good amount of, you know, the block ain't moving. But I've now got to the point where each of the individual bolts is not wiggling and I've got good pressure. I'm going to take the cover off. What I don't want to do now is tighten this too much, so I'll put too much pressure on the CPU, but I also don't want to put myself in a situation where I'm not putting enough pressure, because then I'll get really bad performance in the tests. So yeah, I'm just going to tighten them up a little bit, but I'm not going to go too far, so you just need to be careful when doing that. I've got a wrench set that I can use to do this. That feels like it's on nice and tight to me, so we should be good to go. The fans are a PWM, which has got 4, and the cooler in itself comes included with this 3-way splitter for the fans. So what you have to do is you have to plug each individual fan into these 3 headers, then you have to attach that to the CPU fan header on the motherboard, like so. So once you're done, you can, when you've got it in your case, you'll probably thread these 3 behind and then bring it onto the motherboard. So as I mentioned before, the RGB is daisy chainable. So you can see here, this is the one that's furthest away, so this will go into number 2, and then the one after that will go in, etc, etc. So you can see they've got a male, which you take off the cover, and then you insert into the female of the next cable down, and then again I take the cover off. I'm going to keep those, we're packing it up, I don't want to damage the males. Always be careful with these, because they're not the biggest holes in the world and they're a little bit fragile. The pins are easily bent, and then I'm going to run that behind in this particular case. In your case, again, pun intended, that you know, this will go in behind your motherboard, and then you will attach this to the 3-pin header on your motherboard to control the RGB. One thing I forgot is the pump has a header to get power to the pump, so you need to connect that to, if you've got a pump header somewhere, then connect it to that. If you've not got a pump header, then normally you'll have like an optional fan header on the motherboard next to the CPU fan, so that's what I've had to do in this case. So the install itself, as I mentioned during the install, there was a couple of parts that I didn't really like. All-in-ones are a lot more complicated because you have to attach the fans to the radiator. You've got to make sure you're orientating the fans correctly for the way you're going to either push or pull the air in, or push it out. So you've got that to keep in mind. You've got to watch out for your cable management, because you've got to orientate the fans in a way so the cables go in the right direction for your cable management, and also to go towards the motherboard, for making sure you plug into the right fan port, to make sure you're controlling the coolant, so you make sure it's hooked up to the CPU fan header to make sure that the fans adjust depending on the temperature of the CPU. And also you've got to mount the block. Now mounting the block is very similar to mounting an air cooler. In this particular case, it was 4 prongs that came through, and then you bolt the bolts down. Not a big fan of that approach in some occasions, purely because you can over tighten the block or you can under tighten the block. Now during the video I mentioned that. After doing the initial installation, I did some test runs to make sure it was cooling correctly, which it obviously wasn't. So I adjusted the nuts to make it tighter, which actually went to a point where it went flush on the pins. Once I did that, it was fine. So in retrospective, that wasn't too bad. There was a daisy chain for the RGB control. It's a lot of cables to manage, but it's nice to have the daisy chain. There's no RGB cable coming from the block, so if you don't want to, they include a little controller device. If you don't want to use that, then you've got no way of controlling RGB, which wasn't ideal. But all in all, for an AIO, I don't think the installation was that bad, but being an AIO, it's a lot more complicated than an air cooler. So keep that in mind for some of the scores that I'm going to put up. But let's get to the results. I'll walk you through the scores, and then once I've gone through the scores and I've gone through the league table, I'll give you my final conclusions on the cooler. So base temps. The AMChoice cooler did very well in this category. It was idling at 26 degrees Celsius, which is a great result. As you can see, it puts it lower than any other cooler so far. Bass sound, because you have the 3 fans going, it's not as great as it possibly could be, although it's not the worst, but it's still in the group of coolers which didn't perform that well. But again, because it's got 3 fans, that's probably not a surprise. Cinebench scores, you can see that it basically nearly matched the ID cooler, which was the top of the table so far, but it's still a great performance. It's kind of not a surprise, and we'll get to the reasons in a second when we look at the max temperature, but a great result for the AMChoice cooler. So max temp, this is the reason we got the really good Cinebench score that we got, because if you look, the max temperature didn't really go much over 60 degrees. I think it averaged at around 62 degrees, which is a fantastic result. Kind of on lines of what I was expecting with a 360 cooler, with having all those fans and having liquid cooling. You'd expect it to perform pretty much better than all the other coolers that I've tested so far, and that's what we're seeing. Keep in mind that this costs a lot more money than any other coolers, because you're paying for the block and everything else, so you'd hope to see this, and we saw it, and it was a great result, but it was very expected. The average max sound was actually pretty decent, considering you got 3 fans going and you've also got a pump in the block going as well. So it was only just over 40 decibels, which I thought was a great result. The scoring ranges, they're the same as they are before. I've not made any changes to those. The tiebreaker is still max temp and then max noise. So legal table wise, you can see that it's finished sort of in the middle pack of the coolers, around just below the 30-point mark. Basically, there's a good reason for that, and I'll get to that in the conclusion, but you've got price and installation to contribute to that. But you can see score wise, it was one of the joint leaders of average score, and it was top of the range, the new leader for max temp, which is the kind of performance we're expecting to see from what basically is a more expensive and bigger and bulkier, and you'd expect to be better cooler. So it actually performed that very well. Alright, that's the league table and the scores looked at. Let's now get on to my conclusion. So all in all, as a cooler goes, it's an AIO, so you expect decent performance out of it. And as you saw from the results, by far it kept the CPU the coolest of all the coolers I've looked at so far. It's slightly more noisy than some of the air coolers we looked at, but it's got 3 fans, so you kind of expect that. So it's not a major deal, and the noise wasn't that bad. It finished sort of mid-table for max load, which wasn't too bad at all. But you got the performance as well, because the scores were really good. It didn't finish high in the league table for a couple of reasons. One, the price, and 2, the ease of installation, because obviously being an AIO, it's more complicated to install. But you're paying that kind of penalty for the performance you're getting out of it, and you'll expect this kind of performance out of any AIO. Now, the price of this AIO, it's actually around the same lines as you'd buy some other AIOs, some say like Corsair branded ones. Does it compete with those? It's going to be difficult to tell, because I've not tested any sort of very similar priced AIOs yet. But it performed very well, and at the price it's at, being a 360 cooler, if you said compare that to, say, I don't know, an NZXT cooler, which can be a little bit more expensive, would it be worth buying? Yes. Is the features that I didn't like, with lack of RGB control from the block, that kind of took the edge off a little bit. But all in all, I think it's a pretty good cooler. So jumping back in there for a second, one of the things I don't normally cover when I'm doing the cooler reviews is overclocking, because when I'm doing my cooler comparisons, I'm doing them based on the fact that you buy a cooler and you put it in your system just to cool the CPU that you're buying. In this particular case, because you're investing so much money in an AIO, really, unless you're buying a top-end CPU, well, even if you're not buying a top-end CPU, but if you're buying a top-end CPU, then it's worth the investment for an AIO to cool it. But not just that, for like where I've got, we're over 10700K, which is an unlocked part. The fact that I was only getting a top level around 60 degrees when doing a stress test on this CPU tells me that there's plenty of room left to overclock the CPU using the AIO. So although it breaks away from the way I currently review a cooler, I would definitely say if you've got an unlocked CPU like I've got here, and it gives you the headroom, then one of the benefits you could get for that extra money is to overclock. Alright, I hope you found that information useful. If you've got any questions on the AMChoice cooler, please leave them in the box down below. If you liked the video and you found it informative, please hit the old like button. If you didn't like the video, dislike, but obviously if you did that, can you please leave any constructive criticism down below on how we can improve the videos going forward. If you would like to, it would be great you subscribe. I'm trying to reach the almighty 1,000 subscriptions. I'm getting closer, but still there's a decent amount of time and numbers to go. But yeah, that's everything. Oh, and don't forget to click the bell icon to be notified of any future content that comes out. And as always, take care.